The next is a panel that will lead by Dr. Ziv Katzir, which is the head of the National Program AI Israel Innovation Authority. So please stay seated. We have a little bit more time until we have the served lunch. So Dr. Ziv Katzir, please come to the stage. He's coming? Ziv? He will introduce the panelists, and also we will have people joining from Zoom. Bear with us, please. Dr. Ziv, you are with us? He was here backstage. His admin will call him. Where he disappeared? Again? I thought something happened with AI for you. Okay, no problem. Please, the stage is for you.
Hello, everyone. Don't leave. So, welcome, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be here again at AI Week. Really my beloved conference, not only in Israel, but today with me, I have 4 really wonderful speakers. Joining us from Paris, Audrey, who is the Deputy Director at the OECD, responsible for all digital economy aspects. From Canada, Ottawa, Stuart, who actually was gracious enough to wake up in the middle of the night to join us. And Stuart is a senior trade analyst at the Canadian administration. And with me here in the room, Jan Mak, Singapore's ambassador to Israel. And last but not least, Cedric from the Israeli Ministry of Justice, and dealing with international law, technology, and law. So welcome to everybody here. Our discussion today will go around 2 main topics that are kind of interwoven into one another. One is understanding all the different things that are happening in the AI policy and regulation around the world, and most importantly, how those are combined or should be combined. And the other is talking about the role of medium and small countries in the forming of this policy. And this is why we have Singapore and Israel, and even Canada, which is, well, it's not a small country, but definitely not a superpower in a global arena. No offense, Stuart.
None taken, and I totally agree.
So I'll start with Audrey first, I think. Audrey, during the last 2.5 years, we've seen like a huge amount of international organizations and discussion groups of all sorts trying to establish kind of a regime for AI, going from hard law to soft law to international law, back and forth. So my question to you would be, how do you see all those different initiatives? Do you think they should be combined in one way or the other, and what should be done in order to do so?
Thanks, Ziv, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Sorry to not be with you in Tel Aviv in person, but happy to be able to join. A proliferation of initiatives in the last 5 to 8 years for sure, and I think there is some opportunity for convergence, and then there's some need for different initiatives for different purposes. So I think one way of thinking about it is that in order to govern AI, we need a fairly robust set of tools or a toolbox, and some of those tools need to be soft law, need to be voluntary, need to be normative, and then some of the tools do need to be regulatory or more hard law. And I think in both cases, there's unlikely or probably not ideal to have just one thing. So in the OECD context, we were the first intergovernmental organization to put forward a soft law standard on AI back in 2019. Israel was a leader in helping us get that over the line, as was statutory frameworks and hard law are being built. So we see that both soft law and hard law can work and do work together in an important sort of happy coexistence. Of course, there's a lot of activity in the sort of voluntary commitment space, in the sort of initiative space, and I do think there's some opportunity to bring some of these initiatives together as we move forward in the government. Countries are going to pursue their own regulatory approaches, and we at the OECD, working with our members, but also much more broadly than our membership, are trying to align those regulatory approaches as much as possible to have some coherence, even taking into account different legal and regulatory regimes around the world. So, you know, we might put our risk tolerance at different places, but we might think about risks in the same way. If we, for example, talk about risks with a common taxonomy and a common language, then the standards and the interoperability between countries will be greater. I think we have a lot of examples in the past of where there was opportunity to do that, and maybe the boat was missed. And I think in AI, we're really hoping to advance on what we've built so far to bring that together. So I know we're limited on time, but I'll leave it with that need convergence, because time is limited and the race to AI is moving really fast.
Oh, thank you, Audrey. Stuart, so following up on the messages from Audrey, so Canada is both like a medium player in this global arena and specifically focused on the AI implications of a trade. So if you can say something about the unique role that Canada is playing as kind of a mediator between different opinions that we hear within the negotiation rooms, you know, and how does Canada kind of leverage its unique capabilities to create an influence? That'd be really interesting.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me to appear with this august group. The Canadian experience is that really we need to prioritize and engage strategically with key partners. And we've been trying to leverage Canada's comparative advantage and assist other small, medium-sized economies with aligned interest. And, you know, we've found that we need to engage in deep, sustained cooperation with international partners while drawing on our domestic investments. In terms of achieving AI international trade goals, we are very aware of small and medium-sized economies need to have access to international markets for AI systems, and that we have a relatively large number of AI micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in our economies. And we are seeking to ensure that, the very needed trustworthiness measures achieve their important objectives in the least trade restrictive manner possible. For example, that, we use international standards, that we have non-discriminatory access to regulatory sandboxes, that we have an appropriate level of record keeping, for example. So we're working very hard to reduce AI firms' costs, for example, reduce and minimize conformity assessment costs. We're working hard to apply WTO obligations to government measures applied to AI systems. And we are very keen to engage with like-minded, small, medium-sized countries with, a similar economic structure. And on the margins of the WTO, we are coordinating plurilateral meetings on regulatory barriers to AI and cyber trade. We've been extremely pleased with Israel's participation, and to join us in this endeavor, and we are trying to work to use, Canada's convening power to achieve those goals. In terms of achieving the trustworthiness goals, we worked with France to launch the global partnership on AI. We're working with Israel, the United States, the UK, Japan, on the Council of Europe AI Human Rights Treaty, and we're partnering with Australia and New Zealand on the UN Global Digital Compact. So maybe I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So maybe I'll go back to the room, and Jan, if you can grab a mic. So Singapore, obviously a small country with a very strong technology orientation. And I also know that this concept that was kind of elaborated by Stuart for collaborating with like-minded countries and forming alliances, so is very deeply rooted in the Singaporean approach. So can you say something about how Singapore, as being a small country, still manages to create an influence over the global arena?
Oh, thanks, Steve. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers of AI and Cyber Week for the very kind and warm hospitality to our senior delegation from Singapore visiting for this week. It is a sign of our solidarity and our commitment to the long-term bilateral relationship between Israel and Singapore, even in these challenging times. Thank you. I'd like to say thank you too for having me on this panel to share the perspective of a small state. Singapore is honored to be ranked third in the global AI rankings behind the US and China, and we are consistently ranked in the top 10 in other internationally recognized AI rankings. But at the same time, we are very acutely aware of the challenges and the pains that small states, fellow small states like us, face in this rapidly changing global AI and digital landscape. As small countries with small populations, that means small markets, smaller talent pools, smaller access to large data sets to use to train our models, and an international fora, it's also challenging for us to be plugged in. We had a chat about this, to be plugged into so many different AI forums or platforms that are being proliferated around the world today. And even when we are there, it's difficult for small countries to have a large voice at the table. So what Singapore has done in this case is that we believe that to really use AI for public good, to have an inclusive conversation at the table, we do need to bring along fellow small states to the table. So what we have done, a couple of ways to create more space for small states. One, within our region, Southeast Asia region, it is a diverse region with different countries at different stages of digital transformation. But what we wanted to do was ensure that there is harmonization and interoperability among some of the regulations on the digital space and the AI space that we are making. So we have actually led the formulation of an AI governance framework, a model framework for the whole of Southeast Asia, based on principles that we developed earlier on, and again, in turn, based on OECD principles that we had also mapped very closely to. So in this way, then, companies operating or startups coming to Singapore can actually then have a bit more assurance of the harmonization of laws across the whole region if they want to access the bigger Southeast Asian market. There is another, what I would call a foreign policy innovation that we had, bringing together an informal group of small states. We call it the Forum of Small States. It is a foreign policy grouping, but recently, last year, we decided to develop a digital chapter of the Forum of Small States. So now we are actually bringing together a group of over 100 small states together to have conversations on our different challenges in digital transformation. And we are working together, particularly in the AI space, together with Rwanda and a few other countries, to develop an AI governance playbook so that countries around the world don't have to go through or reinvent the wheel. There already will be a guidebook, there will be a playbook where others can, of course, look at, refer to, and of course then adapt to their own individual and sovereign circumstances and desires. But that's how we are trying to bring the larger community of small countries together to overcome some of the challenges of small size, because ultimately we want to ensure that size is not destiny for us. We want to be able to actually create more space for us and for the larger community at large.
That makes a lot of sense. Cedric, Israel is obviously a very small state, and it's obviously very much dependent on its high-tech ecosystem, right? So what are the unique values that Israel brings to the table, to the negotiation table, and how do you deal with it, right?
Is this on? Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So just before I answer the question of values, one important topic is expertise. And I think Israel is recognized as having a high level of expertise. And it makes sense, and I think that's appreciated by other countries and international forums. And so it makes sense for Israel to have those countries that have a vested interest and expertise in the topics that relate to how governments use and regulate technology. So that's not to answer the question of values, but it's still something important. With respect to values, I don't want to oversimplify, but I think one of the values that Israel brings to the table is the spirit of innovation. Israel very much embraces this idea of innovation. Now, I don't want to have this false opposition between innovation and regulation, innovation and human rights. We like to see them as reinforcing one another, and we like to talk here about responsible innovation. But still, Israel very much embraces the spirit of innovation, and sometimes that does come in and put some question marks with respect to the need to regulate or the manner in which we regulate. I think one approach that we have that's related to this, which it can be a feature and a bug, it's this idea of yeh beseder, it's going to be okay, which is we like to run to the technology first and then deal with the problems afterwards. But in international forums, I think it can be a feature because a lot of international forums, the tendency tends to be, let's over-legalize this, let's define it to death. And then Israel comes to the table and says, wait a second, when we're talking about tech regulation, maybe tech develops very quickly. AI is a very dynamic field, so it makes sense to slow down a little bit and think about things. I'll just give you one example.
He is a lawyer, by the way, right? Guys.
It's just an example. The difference between the concept of a sandbox in the EU and in Israel, as I understand it, in the EU AI Act, the sandbox basically says we have the regulations in place, and we're just going to help companies comply with them, maybe exempt them from fines along the way. But it's like a period of time for the companies to adapt to the regulations. In Israel, the sandbox is the way we think of a sandbox is very different. We think of, okay, we have this new technology, a new toy. We don't know yet how safe or unsafe it is. So before we rush to regulate it, let's work with the companies, allow them to test the product in real time in a controlled environment, and then we can go about regulating. In terms of how we make this voice heard, so first, as a Canadian myself, I think I can tell you Israelis have no problem making their voice heard, but it's really about bluntness, and in international diplomacy, sometimes bluntness is refreshing, so that's another value. And then just to think about things a little bit more strategically, along the lines of what you said, it's basically forging alliances with like-minded countries. Canada has been an incredible partner at the Council of Europe in the forging of in the development of the Treaty on Artificial Intelligence, CAI, and we've worked together with Canada, the US, the UK, Japan, and that allows us to amplify our voice in international forums. And then I think just looking at things a little bit more humbly and acknowledging that Israel doesn't have the answers to all the questions, and we stand to learn from one another. From the U.S., Singapore, each have forged their own path, and so a little bit of humility is also important.
Thank you. Audrey, I think that could be a good point, the discussion, to go back to 2019, right? So OECD was the first international organization to publish anything about trustworthy AI. And it did so with a very, non-committing, soft law, 5 very high-level principles that everyone can relate to very easily. And the surprising part, at least for me, when you kind of sit back and watch it, is that those very high-level principles have managed to create a tremendous effect of everything that happened further on. So how did this magic happen, actually?
Yeah, so it's true that the values debate, there's actually 10 parts of the the recommendation, what we call the principles. There's the values-based principles, and then there's recommendations for policymakers, which are another 5 areas. And I agree, they're fairly high level, and at least at a first blush, a little unobjectionable, depending. I mean, I think there are maybe some countries who would object to certain aspects of that, but the majority certainly wouldn't. And I think that the key to that is that we just didn't stop with that. We took those principles and we said, okay, this is great as a guiding light, but we need implementation. We need to dig deep on what does it mean to do these different things. So back in 2020, early 2020, at the end of February, the last thing we did before everything shut down for COVID is we launched what we affectionately call OECD.ai. And that's where we started to build what we call the OECD, the evidence base of what's happening in AI policy mapped to those principles. And not just in policy, but in venture capital investment, in patents, in research. And so we started to gather data. We have a live trends section on the observatory that is kind of a new thing for the OECD, where we're putting data in front of policymakers that is close to real time, as opposed to data that's coming 3 years later out of national statistical offices and traditional measurement methods. We also built a database of AI policies mapped to the principles and started working with countries on how their policy environments were developing. So I think the thing that made the principles real was that implementation. We didn't just say, great, we wrote a document, it's on the shelf. We put a lot of action over the last 5 years, everything from developing a classification system for AI systems to what some of our more recent products around an AI instance monitor, where we're starting to try to track incidents related to AI systems based on a common, again, standardized taxonomy of risk and harm that our working party has developed. So I think helping people take the broad concepts of trustworthy AI, whether it's fairness or transparency, and think about what that means in certain and specific contexts, is what's made the principles, I think, as effective of a tool as I agree that they have been.
Yeah, I share much of your thoughts personally. Stuart, maybe on moving a little bit forward. We talked a lot about, let's say, the regulatory part of the AI policy, and there is a whole additional branch going within standard organizations. So we have efforts happening in ISO, we have efforts happening in NIST and the European Sensenelec, and also in the Canadian CSA. So, how do you see the interactions between, let's say, regulation and standardization in this regime of AI policy?
Well, an important tool for achieving both trustworthiness and mutually beneficial international trade, especially for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We think it's hugely important to minimize the number of one-off country-specific requirements that countries have to, or exporters have to cope with. We think we really need to use international standards to reduce AI exporters' costs by reducing first, the cost of adjusting products or services to meet varying requirements. And we think they're important also to reducing information costs for firms. Reduce the need to obtain and analyze information on regulatory requirements. So we think international standards are a really key tool for implementing, the broad objectives that are set out in technical regulations on trustworthiness. And we are working with other like-minded small, medium-sized economies to collectively advance the use of international standards. And we are working hard within the International Standards Development Organization they encourage the use of international standards.
Cedric, I'm moving back to you. We really need to go briefly because we're almost running out of time, but we talked a lot about the international aspect, and now I want to go back home to Israel and say, Israel has like 9,000 high-tech companies. It's very much dependent on its high-tech sector. So how does this reflect back to the way that Israel treats AI policy and regulation?
I want to give you an example from what we did in CAI, the convention of the Council of Europe. It was apparent at the outset that the convention was potentially going to apply to the public and private sectors. And it seemed to have like two parents. Parent one, you could say, is the OECD principles, and parent two was the EU AI regulations, which were just a draft at the time, but we saw the direction in which it was going and the implications for the private sector and for small and medium enterprises, startups. Now, I'm just a wild guess here. Everybody in this room either is an entrepreneur or has a friend or family member. We're 1 degree of separation from a startup, so it was really easy for us to pick up the phone to different startups in the fields of health, transportation, finance, web services, and just get their input. What do you think about all this? And the information we got there was really, I think, eye-opening and counterintuitive. It was that they're not against regulation. A lot of these startups are used to, and they understand the need to work in regulation. So just think, for example, a medical device company that uses AI, so they know medical device regulation, same thing for finance, et cetera. So the question was not whether to regulate, it was how, and the problem that they faced the most, or the fear that they had, was regulation that would be overly blunt, overly generic. And so what they sought and embraced and found could be valuable was tailored sector-specific regulation. So this actually informed how we crafted our own domestic AI strategy, which is fostering the sectoral approach based on the OECD principles. And we also were able to bring that nuanced voice to the negotiating table at CAI to present this unique perspective. And so this is in stark contrast from the way a lot of international negotiations often happen, where the large companies are able to have a seat at the table. They have the budget, they have the bandwidth to send someone. So think of the Metas and the Googles and the OpenAIs. And the small and medium companies, they're just not there. So us in Israel, we were able to kind of bring that voice to the table. So I think you could say Israel brings kind of like a valuable set of like a unique outlook on innovation and the connection and the unique perspective of small and medium enterprises that kind of helps craft the international conversation.
And Jan, like perhaps the last question, it's going to go around the interaction between the more localized regional activity that I know Singapore is leading the activity in the Asia-Pacific region, and how does this blend into the more global efforts that happen at the UN, at the OECD, and other fora?
Thanks, Steve. Indeed, we are very aware that even if we have regulations on our own or even in our region, nowadays startups have global international ambitions, and they want to be global from birth. So we want to ensure that wherever they are cited, wherever they grow, they actually are able to adhere to principles that are interoperable with major markets all around the world. So what we have done in Singapore is actually look at where all the key major, well, like Cedric said, parents, right? Where all our parents are. And we've actually done mapping exercises between our principles. We developed AI Verify, which is an AI governance framework and testing toolkit. And we made sure that AI Verify's principles and standards and frameworks actually map to whatever is going on being developed by the US, by NIST in the risk management framework. So we actually sat down with the technical teams, had a mapping of all the different criteria and frameworks and principles, and we actually mapped it one-to-one to ensure that if there were startups based in Singapore, our Singaporean companies from birth can say that if they've adhered to Singapore's principles and they have used our toolkit to prove that they've adhered to the principles, they are actually then going to have easier access to the US market with this harmonization of principles. So we are doing the same with the Hiroshima principles. We are doing the same, having a conversation with the EU. And so that's what we want to do to help our countries and help smaller countries in general actually be able to access a much larger market. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, guys. And thank you our wonderful panelists, especially for Audrey, who joins us at the middle of the AIW committee session in Paris, and for Stuart, who woke up really in the middle of the night. Thank you all, and thank you guys in the audience.
Thank you very much.